Meet someone in exactly the position a lot of you are in right now. 58 years old, $180,000 left on the mortgage at 6%, planning to retire in 7 years, and they just came into $150,000. An inheritance, a bonus, doesn't matter which. The question on their mind is the same one that's probably brought you here. Pay off the house or invest it? By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what the real math says for someone in that exact position. The rate, the timeline, the tax situation, all of it. And more importantly, you'll know how to run that same math for your own numbers, whatever they are. This isn't going to be a generic "it depends." It's going to be a specific answer, built piece by piece, the same way we'd build it for our own family. Let's start where almost every article on this topic starts, because it's a real starting point, just not the whole story. Paying off a mortgage at 6% is, in a very real sense, a guaranteed 6% return. Every dollar you put toward that principal is a dollar of debt you no longer pay interest on. And that return is locked in, no market risk, no volatility, nothing. Compare that to the stock market. Over the past 30 years, the S&P 500 has averaged roughly 10.3% a year. After you adjust for inflation, that's closer to 7% in real purchasing power. Either way you slice it, the historical expected return of investing has been higher than a 6% guaranteed return. Run that gap out over time and the numbers get dramatic. $100,000 invested at a 10% average return grows to roughly $1.74 million over 30 years. That same $100,000, if it went toward a 6% mortgage instead, would have saved something in the neighborhood of $66,000 in interest. On paper, that's not close. Investing wins by a wide margin. For our 58-year-old with the $150,000, this first pass at the math says, invest it. Don't touch the mortgage. But, and this is important, that math assumes 30 years of compounding, no market crashes at the wrong moment, and a tax and timeline situation that may not actually match this person's real life. We're just getting started, because that invested answer is about to get tested against reality, piece by piece. Keep that invested answer in your head loosely, because we're about to test it against reality. Your action for this first part. Find your actual mortgage rate, not what you remember, the real number on your statement. Because everything after this depends on that one figure. Here's the mechanic that almost every generic article skips past, and it's the single most useful piece of information in this entire video. Financial researchers who've actually run this comparison across different rate environments generally land on the same rough zones. If your mortgage rate is above 7%, paying it down early tends to be the clear winner. The guaranteed return is simply too good to pass up. If your rate is below 5%, investing tends to win clearly, because the historical market spread is too large to ignore. And if you're sitting between 5 and 7%, which, as of 2026, is exactly where the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate sits, around 6.4%, you're in what's genuinely a gray zone. The math alone doesn't hand you a clean answer. Here's what that means for our case study. A 6% rate sits almost exactly in the middle of that gray zone. Cycle 1's math said invest it. But Cycle 1's math was built on the average outcome, over an average 30-year stretch, with no other complicating factors. Our 58-year-old isn't investing for 30 years. They're investing for 7, and then living off whatever's left. That's a completely different math problem, and we haven't touched it yet. Your action for this cycle. Figure out which zone your own rate falls into. Here's the mechanic that almost every generic article skips past, and it's the single most useful piece of information in this entire video. Financial researchers who've actually run this comparison across different rate environments generally land on the same rough zones. If your mortgage rate is above 7%, paying it down early tends to be the clear winner. The guaranteed return is simply too good to pass up. If your rate is below 5%, investing tends to win clearly, because the historical market spread is too large to ignore. And if you're sitting between 5 and 7%, which, as of 2026, is exactly where the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate sits, around 6.4%, you're in what's genuinely a gray zone. The math alone doesn't hand you a clean answer. It's worth pausing on why that gray zone exists at all, instead of just accepting it as a fact. The zone isn't fuzzy because researchers couldn't agree on a number. It's fuzzy because the actual outcome inside that range depends heavily on which years you happen to invest through, the exact thing an average can't tell you in advance. Above 7%, the guaranteed return is high enough that it beats almost any realistic bad stretch the market could throw at you. Below 5%, the market's edge is wide enough that it survives almost any realistic bad stretch too. It's only in the 5 to 7 range that the outcome genuinely tips back and forth, depending on timing you can't control in advance. That's not a flaw in the framework. That's the framework being honest with you about where certainty actually ends. Here's what that means for our case study. A 6% rate sits almost exactly in the middle of that gray zone. The earlier math said invest it, but that math was built on the average outcome over an average 30-year stretch with no other complicating factors. Our 58-year-old isn't investing for 30 years. They're investing for 7 and then living off whatever's left. That's a completely different math problem, and we haven't touched it yet. It's also worth noticing something about how mortgage rates actually get set in the first place, because it explains why so many people find themselves exactly in this gray zone rather than clearly on one side or the other. Rates move with the broader economy. When borrowing is expensive across the board, both mortgage rates and expected investment returns tend to shift together, not independently. That's part of why the obvious above 7, obvious below 5 split holds up reasonably well across different time periods, even though the specific numbers move. The relationship between the two sides of this decision isn't random. It's connected, and understanding that connection is more useful than memorizing any single year's exact threshold. Your action for this cycle. Figure out which zone your own rate falls into, above 7, below 5, or the gray zone in between. That single number tells you how much weight the rest of this video's factors should actually carry for your specific situation. If you're clearly outside the gray zone, some of what comes next matters less for you. If you're inside it, like our case study, everything that follows is going to do the actual deciding. But here's a piece of this case study I haven't fully unpacked yet. 7 years until retirement. That single detail is about to matter more than the interest rate itself. And in a few minutes, you'll see exactly why it can flip this entire decision. Here's a fact that a lot of older mortgage advice gets wrong because it hasn't caught up with how the tax code actually works now. For decades, the mortgage interest deduction was one of the biggest arguments against paying off your house early. Every dollar of interest you paid was a dollar you could deduct from your taxable income. That was real, and it mattered. And it's the reason your parents or grandparents may have specifically been advised to keep a mortgage rather than pay it off, even when they could afford to. But the standard deduction nearly doubled under the 2018 tax law changes, and it's continued adjusting upward since. The practical result: the large majority of homeowners no longer itemize their deductions at all, because the standard deduction alone is worth more than their itemized total would be. If you don't itemize, the mortgage interest deduction isn't reducing your tax bill by a single dollar. You're not using it, even though you're still paying the interest. This is one of the clearest examples in personal finance of advice going stale without anyone announcing that it changed. Nobody sent out a memo saying, the mortgage interest deduction argument no longer applies to most people. The advice just kept circulating unchanged years after the underlying tax law shifted beneath it. That's worth remembering any time you hear a financial rule of thumb repeated with total confidence. The rule might have been true once, under a tax code or interest rate environment that no longer exists. Here's what this means for our case study, and probably for you too. Before you count the tax benefit of my mortgage as a factor in this decision, check whether you're actually itemizing on your tax return. If you're taking the standard deduction, and statistically you probably are, that argument for keeping the mortgage simply doesn't apply to your real numbers, even though it still gets repeated constantly. There's a second, quieter tax angle worth mentioning here too, specifically for anyone close to retirement like our case study. Money that goes into paying down a mortgage doesn't generate any taxable events at all. No capital gains, no dividends to report, nothing. Money that goes into a taxable brokerage account, on the other hand, can generate tax obligations along the way, depending on how it's invested and whether it's inside a retirement account or not. That's not a reason by itself to choose one path over the other, but it is one more small piece of the full picture, and it's exactly the kind of detail that a quick online calculator won't ask you about. Your action here: pull up last year's tax return and check one box. Did you itemize or take the standard deduction? If it's the standard deduction, cross the tax benefit argument off your list entirely. It's not real for you, and continuing to factor it in is going to bias your decision toward keeping debt you don't actually need to keep. Now here's the mechanic that the generic invest historical returns are higher advice almost always leaves out, and it's the one that actually matters most for our 58-year-old. In an earlier video on this channel, we covered a piece of research that's directly relevant here. Roughly 77% of your total retirement outcome is determined by the market returns of just the first 10 years after you retire. Not the whole 30-year average, the first 10 years specifically. If the market drops hard during that window and you're forced to draw down a portfolio that just took a hit, that damage doesn't undo itself even when the market eventually recovers. Let's make that concrete instead of abstract, because the mechanism matters. Imagine two people with identical portfolios, identical withdrawal amounts, and identical average returns over a 30-year retirement. The only difference is which years the bad returns happen to land in. One person hits a rough market in year 1 or 2 of retirement, while they're still withdrawing from a portfolio that hasn't had time to recover. The other person hits the exact same rough market in year 25, after decades of growth have already built a much larger cushion. On paper, both retirees experience the same average return over their whole retirement. In practice, the first person can run out of money years earlier than the second because they were forced to sell shares at depressed prices early on, permanently reducing how much they had left to grow back. Same average, wildly different outcomes. That's what sequence of returns risk actually means, stripped of the jargon. Here's why that changes our case study completely. The $100,000 example from earlier assumed 30 years of smooth average compounding. But our 58-year-old isn't investing for 30 years before they need the money. They're investing for 7 years until retirement, and then they're immediately inside that highest risk 10-year window we just described. If the market has a rough patch anywhere in roughly that 13 to 15-year stretch, the invested historical returns win math from earlier can fall apart in practice, even though it looks great on a 30-year spreadsheet. This is exactly why paying off the mortgage, a guaranteed risk-free return, carries more real weight for someone close to retirement than the raw historical average math suggests. It's not that the market math is wrong, it's that average return over 30 years and average return over the next 10 to 15 years, right when you can least afford a bad stretch, are two very different bets, even though they're built from the exact same historical data set. There's a practical version of this risk worth naming directly because it's not hypothetical. It's happened multiple times in the last few decades alone. Anyone who retired right before a major market downturn and was forced to draw down a shrinking portfolio during the recovery years learned this lesson the expensive way. Anyone who happened to retire a few years earlier or later, missing that downturn entirely, never had to learn it at all, through no skill or foresight of their own, just timing. That's an uncomfortable truth about retirement math. A meaningful part of your outcome depends on which decade you happen to retire into, a factor completely outside your control. The only lever you actually have is how much guaranteed, no-risk ground you're standing on when that unlucky timing happens to land on you. Your action for this cycle: figure out how many years you actually have until you plan to draw from this money. The closer that number is to retirement, the more the guaranteed return side of this decision deserves extra weight, regardless of what the historical average says. This is the single biggest reason a 65-year-old and a 35-year-old staring at the exact same 6% mortgage rate can arrive at completely different correct answers. So does that settle it? Should our case study just pay off the house? Not quite yet. There's one more factor that can override everything we've covered so far, and it has nothing to do with interest rates or the stock market at all. Here's the piece of this decision that spreadsheets consistently miss. Because it isn't really about return at all. It's about liquidity. Money that goes into your home equity doesn't disappear, but it does become much harder to access. If an emergency comes up, a medical bill, a major repair, anything unplanned, you can't just withdraw equity from your house the way you can sell shares from a brokerage account. You'd need a home equity loan, a line of credit, or a full refinance, and none of those are instant, and none of them are guaranteed to be available on good terms when you actually need them, especially if the emergency itself, like a job loss or a health event, is exactly the kind of thing that makes lenders more cautious about approving new credit in the first place. Paying off a mortgage early doesn't create an emergency fund. It converts liquid, accessible money into illiquid, hard-to-reach money. That's a completely reasonable trade if you already have real liquid savings sitting elsewhere. But it's a genuinely risky trade if that windfall was your only real cushion. It helps to think about this in terms of what financial planners sometimes call the difference between being rich on paper and being flexible in practice. A person with all their money in home equity and none in accessible savings can have a strongly positive net worth and still be one unexpected bill away from a real problem, simply because none of that net worth can move quickly when it needs to. Flexibility and net worth are related, but they are not the same thing. And this entire mortgage versus invest decision is really a decision about which one you're prioritizing at this specific moment in your life. For our case study, this is the deciding question we haven't asked yet. Does this 58-year-old already have 6 to 12 months of expenses sitting in an accessible emergency fund, separate from this $150,000? If yes, paying down a meaningful chunk of the mortgage is on the table. If no, that comes first, full stop, before a single dollar goes toward the house or the market. It's worth being specific about what accessible actually means here too, because not all savings are equally liquid even when they're not tied up in a house. A retirement account you'd face penalties for withdrawing from early isn't truly accessible for emergency purposes, even though it shows up as an asset on paper. A certificate of deposit that locks your money up for a fixed term isn't fully accessible either, not without giving up some of the return. The kind of accessible we mean here is a savings or money market account you could genuinely draw from within a day or two, penalty-free, no questions asked. If most of what you'd call your savings doesn't meet that bar, it's worth being honest with yourself about how thin your real cushion actually is before this decision gets made. Your action here. Before this decision touches either the mortgage or an investment account, confirm your own emergency fund is fully funded and untouched by whatever you're about to decide. This step isn't optional, and it isn't negotiable based on how good the rest of the math looks. It comes first, every time, for everyone, regardless of what rate zone you're in or how many years you have left until retirement. There's one more angle worth including before we bring everything together, because it's real, even though it doesn't show up in any spreadsheet, the psychological weight of debt itself. Researchers who study financial behavior have found fairly consistently that people who pay off debt, even when the pure math says investing would have produced a better outcome, report higher satisfaction with that decision than people who followed the mathematically optimal path instead. Being debt-free carries a value that doesn't show up in a compound interest calculator, and dismissing that as irrational misses something important. A financial plan you can actually stick with and sleep well with is worth more in practice than a theoretically optimal plan that quietly stresses you out every time the market has a bad month. This doesn't mean emotion should override every number we've covered. It means emotion is a legitimate fifth input, not something to feel guilty about weighing. If the idea of carrying a six-figure mortgage into retirement genuinely keeps you up at night, that discomfort is information. The same way a mortgage rate or a tax bracket is information. A framework that ignores how a decision actually feels to live with isn't a more rigorous framework. It's an incomplete one. Let's bring every piece of this back together, because separately, each part gave a different answer. And that's exactly why generic advice on this topic is so often wrong. The real answer only shows up when you run all the factors together. Here's the framework. Where does your rate fall? Above 7, below 5, or the gray zone in between? How many years until you actually need this money? Decades away, or inside that first critical stretch before and after retirement? Are you actually getting a real tax benefit? Or are you taking the standard deduction like most people? Is your emergency fund already fully funded, separate from this decision? And finally, honestly, how much does carrying this debt actually weigh on you, independent of what the numbers say it should? Now let's resolve our case study with all 5 answers on the table. 6% rate, squarely in the gray zone, no clean answer from the rate alone. 7 years to retirement, inside the highest risk window, where a guaranteed return carries real extra weight. Very likely taking the standard deduction, so the classic tax argument for keeping the mortgage doesn't actually apply here. For this example, let's say the emergency fund is already solid, separate from the windfall. And let's say, like a lot of people approaching retirement, the idea of still owing 6 figures on the house when the paychecks stop is a genuine source of stress. Given all 5 factors together, the honest answer for this specific person isn't a clean invest all of it or pay off all of it. It's a split. Put a meaningful portion, say half, toward the mortgage, both for the guaranteed return and for the real psychological value of walking into retirement with a smaller, more predictable monthly obligation. Invest the rest, since 7 years still gives real growth potential without betting the entire decision on either side. That's not a cop-out answer. It's what actually falls out of the math and the reality once you stop treating pay off the mortgage and invest instead as the only 2 options on the table. A partial paydown, timed and sized deliberately, is a completely legitimate third path. And for anyone sitting in that same gray zone rate with a retirement timeline measured in single-digit years, it's very often the answer that holds up best once every factor gets counted instead of just the first one. It's also worth saying plainly that this framework doesn't produce the same split answer for everyone, and it shouldn't. Someone in their 30s, decades from retirement, with a mortgage rate under 5%, comfortable liquid savings, and no particular emotional weight attached to the debt, could reasonably run this exact same 5-factor process and land on investing the entire amount, with real confidence that it's the right call for their situation. The framework isn't designed to always land in the middle. It's designed to make sure the actual answer, whatever it turns out to be, reflects your real numbers instead of a rule of thumb built for someone else's. Your action this week. Run your own 5 answers. Your rate zone, your years to your money being needed, your actual tax situation, your emergency fund status, and honestly, how the debt itself weighs on you. And see which way your own version of this framework leans. Write all 5 down in one place. Most people carry pieces of this decision around in their head, half remembered, and never actually see all 5 factors sitting next to each other at the same time. Seeing them together is usually what makes the answer obvious, even when no single factor was obvious on its own. So here's the real answer to pay off the mortgage or invest. It was never actually a coin flip between 2 options. It's 5 separate questions, and the honest answer for most people close to retirement, like our 58-year-old, usually isn't all or nothing at all. If you want to see exactly how the first 10 years after retirement can make or break decisions just like this one, that's the video right before this one on this channel. Go Go watch it next. Subscribe so you don't miss what we build next.